Hello, everyone. And so, yes, we're shifting focus just as slightly to broaden the perspective on the bioeconomy to include the agri-food sector. It's my pleasure to introduce and moderate this panel on catalyzing systems thinking success. My name is Tarra Drevet. As Jeff mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Agri-Food Benchmarking, which is part of CAPI, based in Ottawa. So over the past few years, a growing coalition of organizations working in the Canadian agri-food sector has put together a framework of 20 indicators to measure sustainability outcomes for the sector across 4 areas. That's environment, finance, food integrity, which is basically food production, looking at traceability, food safety, as well as social factors such as labor market inclusivity, diversity, attractiveness, and of course food security. So this is a grassroots movement that began with 12 organizations, and today we're 155 organizations and still growing. We're focusing on how to measure, and what to prioritize for data when we talk about sustainability outcomes for the Canadian agri-food sector. And I can't say it enough that working in agriculture, agri-food, which is basically like processed primary agriculture, whether it be forestry, aquaculture, we're working in an ecosystem. And the role that each of us play as a contributor to the bioeconomy has both indirect and direct impacts on other areas. So I'm proud to be introducing this discussion about systems thinking because it's what is going to enable us to appreciate those connections between the management of energy security and food security, between nutrition for plants, soils, humans, and animals, as well as how we're going to do more with less resources and really lean into circular nutrient use in a low waste or no waste economy. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our 3 distinguished speakers today. We have a lot of experience and wisdom to share. I'll start with Wendy L., just here, President of Industries in Transition. Wendy has 30 years of experience in consulting, market intelligence, and media across tech, sustainability, energy, and agri-food. Nick Betts, in the middle, is Managing Director of Canadian Alliance for Net Zero Agri-Food, also known as CANZA. And then we have Michelina Aguanno, who is a PhD candidate at the Ivey Business School, part of Western University. She's focusing on how regenerative agriculture and systems thinking can advance the bioeconomy. So we're going to dive into this discussion, and I'd like to start by asking Michelina, can you please tell us what you mean when you think about systems thinking from the perspective of agri-food and the broader bioeconomy? Please.
Yeah, thank you. So to start by defining systems thinking, I'm first going to start by defining what is a system. And a system is a set of elements that are interconnected to achieve some sort of broader purpose. And that sounds really vague and broad, so I'll give a bit of an example. The human body is a system. To understand the human body, it's not just a sum of its parts, but somehow you need to understand how the elements of the human body work together to achieve the purpose that is you existing. So humans are systems, organizations are systems, but organizations are also embedded in broader ecological systems, economic systems, and social systems, political systems. So if that's what systems are, what is systems thinking? And systems thinking is an approach to solving complex problems by looking at the holistic system rather than breaking it down into small elements. So, for example, when you zoom out and you look at the bigger picture, you start to see interconnections, new patterns, and dynamics that you don't see when you're looking at the smaller elements or parts. So what does that mean for the bioeconomy and scaling up? Why are we talking about systems thinking here? When we're talking about scaling up the bioeconomy, we need to look beyond just our organizations and the technical challenges that we're facing, and also beyond value change, but instead also consider these broader systems. And I think it was someone yesterday that mentioned this is one of the only conferences where you have cross-sectoral collaboration here, like you actually bring in across sectors. And I think that's really powerful because that is a bit of a systems approach. And somehow when you bring people together and collaborate across systems, now you're able to see new patterns, new dynamics that emerge. Maybe there's problems and solutions in other sectors. So you draw new insights when you're looking from that systems perspective.
Excellent. Thank you so much for starting us off. I'm going to ask each of our speakers to talk a bit about a current project that really applies this more holistic systems thinking approach to product solutions for energy and agriculture. I'm going to tell each of you to feel free to jump in. We're going to make this more of a discussion, so if you have points to add, please do. We're going to have 2 rounds of questions, one on current projects, the other on enabling conditions for both these projects and the broader bioeconomy in Canada. Then I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. So as you're listening, please feel free to write your questions on those index cards in the middle of your tables. Put up your hand. I'll get the questions at the end. We'll try to leave room for a bit of discussion. So Nick, can you please start us off? Would you like to talk about a current project that you're involved with that illustrates a systems thinking approach to product development in the bioeconomy? Please.
That's my whole job. So CANZA is a giant project, right? When we're talking about agri-food, we're talking about carbon, low CIs. I mean, we look at carbon in the agricultural space. It's typically across Canada, we break it down into 3 buckets. We have nitrogen, so production and use. We have methane, front of the cow, back of the cow, and we have everything else, usually on-farm fuel. We have this magic wand in our pocket, though, because we can sequester carbon in agriculture, in land sector, as you all know, forestry and ag. The challenge with agriculture is it is usually annual in what that looks like. So when we're talking about carbon budgets, how it works with greenhouse gas protocol, other global standards, it's a completely different type of accounting and calculations than it is if you were looking at it from a forestry perspective. I've done both as a climate consultant, and I tell you, agricultural systems are a pain in the butt compared to forestry. So I do appreciate the challenge. But when we're looking at it from an agricultural sense, all 3 of those elements are very important, going back to the systems thinking. There are system solutions for each of those areas that we can pull on, but the challenge is they're all interrelated. And it comes back to this general idea that 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2. It can equal 1 or it can equal 10. And from an agricultural lens, when we're looking at these different elements and these sliding scales, the trick of what CANZA is to try to figure out how to pull on those different sliding scales to make sure that we can equal 10 and not 1 when we add everything together. So an example of that we're working on right now is looking at everything, when you're talking about an integrated livestock farm, growing their own feed, we're talking about a sequestration element in the soil, we're talking about a nitrogen use when they're not growing the forage for other cash crops, we're talking about that product going into an animal in a way that is, from a feed perspective, efficient, but also reducing methane. And then what comes out of the back of that animal, is there an opportunity to put it into things like anaerobic biodigesters and getting other sectors engaged, like many of the oil and gas sector that have renewable gas requirements or targets in the near future to say, can we upgrade that gas and put it into a system? So many different players and many different ways of doing this and combining it all together. One last thing is when we're talking about this, when we're talking about agri-food, it's interesting. We talk about agri-food as if it's one thing, but agriculture is one thing and processing is one thing, and they are completely different technologies, completely different politics. They're governed by 2 different ministries at every provincial and federal level. So just to put it into perspective, when we're talking about complexity and we're talking about systems thinking, I do really feel that agriculture is a great test case for other systems that we have to apply this to in the future.
Yep, love it. Wendy, please, can you talk about your experience with projects that have benefited from systems thinking?
For sure. I think the reason I was invited on this panel is if you kind of look at, 30 years of experience, I've worked equally in energy and agri-food. And so I work very much in that nexus in the middle. I think there's a lot of magic that happens with respect to the bioeconomy. We've been talking about it for the last day and a half here. I've been blessed to have the opportunity to work in divisions of trade media for 16 years to inform the newsrooms. So I've had the ability to work with market intelligence and software tools to understand and appreciate the data that is changing and the system sensing that is changing how we need to operate in agriculture and in energy. What are the technologies that kind of underpin to guide where we need to be? And then I've also, the other half of my career was spent working direct with clients. And so I think the reason I was brought onto the panel for systems thinking is I've worked with large companies, I've worked with small companies, I work with a lot of associations, do a lot of stakeholder management work. And really, by seeing the world from so many different angles, you start to appreciate the system thinking. So the examples I'm going to give two quick. So one then they're both that I'm working with currently. So Agrivoltaics Canada is both an organization that is operating to showcase the virtues of agrivoltaics, which I'll talk about in a second, but also to help advocate and manage and create standards of practice for the individual members. And so agrivoltaics, for those of you that do not know, it's actually using dual utilization of land. So instead of a farmer having to give up his farmland to put solar panels on it, we have this beautiful opportunity to generate solar panels that can be angled and actually still either run a row crop or a grazing operation between the panels. And the beauty of what it does and where this symbiotic nature exists is the actual panels themselves create a shading environment, improve ecosystem, the water efficiencies underneath the panel. They actually limit the amount of sunlight sometimes. We've got a lot of operations happening in southern Alberta where sometimes we get too much sun for the plants. So we have this beautiful ability to kind of manipulate the conditions. And so it creates an opportunity also to accelerate the soil improvement. So by creating these conditions in these ecosystems, we can actually use less chemicals, or in many cases no chemicals, to actually manage the crop situation. So it creates an accelerated effect to get to a regenerative farm practice, for example. The second example is I'm a founder, and it's only 1 year old, and it's a grassroots movement similar to yours. But the organization is called North American Bioeconomy Data Alliance. And we've heard a lot in the last day and a half about biomass utilization, biomass optimization. Literally today, we heard from the buyer side, the struggles that they have with respect to measuring carbon intensity and choosing winners and losers. We heard from the origination side and really the problems that happen with kind of pushing it through a supply chain that either wants it or doesn't want it or doesn't recognize its value. And then we also heard from Scott at Six Ring in the middle, who's a processor that's they themselves and are offering a solution to a very challenging space on the processing of certain kinds of biomass. Well, what NABD is all about is taking that and taking all of you that are involved in that and taking it a step where we haven't seen anyone take it before, and that's the data optimization. So what are the important data sets that are important for helping to accelerate or get to a quick point of failure on certain kinds of buy-sell activities in a biomass? And so what we're doing is we're working with the U.S. Department of Energy, the USDA, Ag Gateway. We're, in the U.S., we're working with Petroleum Products Data Management Association, because they are transferring a lot of learning with respect to their accurate capture of data sets and having it, creating a governance structure and standards of practice across the utility of data. And so what we're essentially trying to do is, in Canada as well, we're working with Alberta Forest Products as a supplier, or as a supporter, Canadian Ag Automation Intelligence Network. And actually, in the last 9 months, we've gotten quite a few people interested, and actually some here as well, so we can talk about kind of involvement going forward. But what we're literally doing is trying to do a better job, and we're working off of some pre-existing work that U.S. Department of Energy has done on generating a gap analysis on the accessibility of some of this data. So the challenge is often in who owns the data or how the data is being captured. So we're trying to layer a level of sophistication on helping to improve that valuation exercise. We heard it 3 or 4 times this morning about improving that valuation and the monetization, so we're layering that level on top of that. So that's what NABD is about. So if anybody has any question about that, you can certainly come talk to me about it.
Okay, terrific. We're going to keep going down the line of the panel here. So In terms of systems thinking and projects, we've talked about biodigesters, agrivoltaics, biomass tracking and monitoring. Now, Michelina, can you please add to this? What kinds of projects have you been involved with that involve this kind of cross-sectoral collaboration?
Thank you. So one of the hats that I wear is I'm a researcher at an innovation lab at Ivey Business School called Innovation North. And one of the things we do is that we're a group of researchers and practitioners that are working on how can we solve complex problems that organizations face using systems thinking. So that's kind of that approach. And I wanted to use an example of a cross-sectoral collaboration in the bioeconomy based on a workshop that we did with CSA Group over here. You might have heard Lynn mention it yesterday. That really convened actors across the national scale of the bioeconomy to try and figure out how can we actually implement systems change here and what are the role of standards in implementing the systems change. So there's a lot of familiar faces in the room because I think a lot of you were actually involved in that project, but we convened actors from the different sectors in the bioeconomy, but also different positions in the value chain to kind of provide that systems perspective. But as you can imagine, the process of convening actors is very complex. So how do we do it? How do we encourage people to come together and really think about systems? And how is that actually useful in solving problems? Because there's this balance between getting too into the complexity, but also trying to see that holistic perspective. So we actually brought people together and tried to map the system. So people mapped what are the processes within the bioeconomy, where their role is in the system, and what the interconnections were, and where they had agency in the system. And more importantly, the barriers of what was preventing advancement in the bioeconomy. And what happened there is we ended up with very complex maps with a lot of sticky notes and drawing on them. But when you took a step back and started to talk across other tables, you started to see some cross-sectoral opportunities. You started to see commonalities between forestry and agriculture, for example, that wasn't pointed out before if you're just focusing in your lane. You start to see where there are different actors that have agency in the system. And importantly, certain leverage points of here are spots that there are a lot of barriers, but we have a solution for that. And it's just about deploying those solutions. So where can we take small actions in the systems that really aggregate to these big changes to see it happen? So I'm not going to go too into depth because there's a full report coming out, and as Lynn mentioned yesterday, there's a primer out that kind of talks about what are some of the findings of this workshop. And what are the implications for standards in the bioeconomy. But one of the things that I wanted to point out and notice with these cross-sectoral collaborations is that there's a lot of barriers experienced by the direct actors in the value chain. But when you take a step back and you look out, there's a lot of solutions that are available and a huge role that what we call like enabling actors play. So these are the actors that aren't necessarily involved directly in the value chain with the flow of materials, but have something to offer in the flow of information, the flow of capital, how to create a regulatory environment that really they're setting the enabling conditions for the success of actors in the bioeconomy. So in addition to removing the specific barriers for the direct actors, I think the systems thinking approach to the bioeconomy is about how are we creating these enabling conditions and what roles do these actors play that can support the environment for change.
Okay, that's a terrific segue for the next question. Please write down your questions on your index cards. We're going to talk about the enabling conditions, like how does it help us to take this step back and have a holistic view across sectors, provincial governments as well as federal, the value chain itself, what are some of the pressures and energy being supplied that creates barriers or that creates opportunities. So Wendy, I'm going to start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about the enabling conditions? And we are running against time, maybe a minute and a half for this, for the bioeconomy.
For sure, and I think the biggest things, a lot of them have been said over the last couple of days, but there was actually a couple that weren't, so I'm going to kind of highlight those. A lot of the work that I've done that has either seen an impasse or actually helped accelerate an effort, actually start or stop, is organizations or entities or coalitions that recognize the human aspect of change. And that's, if people are afraid, no matter how good the technology is, we will not see that adoption cycle go up. And so how do we manage that front-end fear, whether it's real or perceived? And so a lot of the work that I do, we talked about workshopping, Michelina, a lot of workshopping to really get into kind of that that which underpins fear, which is a big one. Another one, second one is the sort of the hat we all wear in, we have a commercial hat and we have a social hat. So we can advocate for something, but we don't want it in our own backyard. So you're dealing with kind of some of that, and there's a lot of that going on. And then the second enabling factor that kind of hasn't been brought up is the next generation, and we've talked about skilling up, but what's very cool about the bioeconomy is I work with a lot of not-for-profits and academic institutions, and they're actually starting to change their curriculums to re-educate that next generation to recognize that you can have, you know, a stance in the bioeconomy, but what does that mean if you're going into construction? I mean, my daughter's going into psychology, fourth-year psychology student, and they're teaching her about the psychological effects of climate change. So it's finding its way into the curriculum of so many different things, and so I think it's pressure testing and sensing that next generation, which is an enabling factor for us as well. So.
Okay, that's terrific. Michelina, can you build on that? You know, you're working in regenerative agriculture and in finance. I mean, there's got to be challenges around how you value the long-term impacts of regen ag. What are you seeing in terms of enabling conditions for the bioeconomy? What can we learn from that?
Yeah, I wanted to give a nod to regenerative agriculture too, because that's something that we don't often talk about, but is a very important opportunity for the bioeconomy to some extent. So just to define regenerative agriculture really quick, there is no standard definition of regenerative agriculture. Maybe that's something CSA is also going to be working on. But I've heard it defined by producers, so farmers and ranchers, as narrowly as a set of practices that are environmentally friendly on the land, and as broadly as just a paradigm of farming that's really understanding how you can invest and support the ecosystem to help with agricultural production. So, you know, there might be some producers in the room and some producers that I've talked to that have said regenerative agriculture, that's just good land management to some extent. But when we're thinking about how to enable regenerative agriculture as an example, it's important but also often under-leveraged because, as Lacey mentioned yesterday, regeneration is just an important part of the long-term productivity of the bioeconomy. And she was talking about regeneration in forestry, but it's the same in agriculture. And throughout the whole conference, we've been talking a lot about products, but the bioeconomy doesn't just start at biomass. And there's also an opportunity for ecosystem services that we can look at in terms of helping stimulate economic production. But so there's a lot of pressure for farmers to be sustainable, and one of the big challenges here is how do you actually value ecosystem services? How do you support this part of the bioeconomy? And in talking to farmers, they often face the pressure for change, but they face the most barriers. There's high costs, they're facing all of the risks right now, and there are benefits, but they also accrue to other actors. So a big question is, how can you finance this, and what does this look like? And taking a systems perspective to that, there's other actors at different parts of the value chain and also broader systems that can kind of play a role to support that. And we're running out of time, so I want to leave it really brief, but one example that I wanted to nod to was Alternative Land Use Services Canada has an example of an innovative way that they're financing regenerative agriculture, in that they're actually paying farmers for what they call a new acre. So they're paying farmers for ecosystem services. So they're changing how we think about productive farmland, and it's not just about the products you produce, but actually how can farmers be paid for, you know, the work they're doing to help clean watersheds and the work they're doing to help abate flooding. So these are all important things that we can start to think about, and opportunities for the future of how are we looking at ecosystem goods and services in the bioeconomy as well.
Terrific. Nick, can you help us with this? I know you're working extensively in this area. Please feel free to expand on some best-in-class examples. What are some of the enabling conditions that you see?
In 90 seconds or less. Yeah, thank you.
You get 2 minutes.
So, I mean, three things to kind of wrap up and set the scene for what I'm talking about is most of the things we do as a species isn't because we want to do them, it's to avoid pain. So when we think of decisions, what are we trying to avoid? So, and when we talk about farmers, that's a lot of things. There's a lot of things out of controls of farmers that we can work towards to try to incentivize action. The second thing is around financing. So we've heard a lot about how climate financing is constantly going down. That pool of money is shrinking. 25% of the world's emissions come from land sector industries. 4% of climate finance goes to that 20%. So that's a huge disconnect, right? So we're not doing a good job of getting the money that we deserve. It's hard to incentivize change with farmers to negotiate pain when you don't have money to pay for it. The third thing is we don't pay for the value that we get out of this. So when we talk about a farmer growing food, we pay for the food. That's valuable to us. We eat it. We don't talk about the climate impact. We don't pay for that as a society. Companies don't pay for the carbon credits, typically, that they're benefiting from when they require certain practices on that farm. Governments don't benefit from the risk reduction that as a company or as a country we're not going to be exposed to. And financiers and insurance usually don't take into account the decreased risk exposure associated with different climate-smart practices. Largely because we don't have the data. Coming back, I think we just that was a good way of summarizing, I think, everything here. But those are kind of the three pieces that we really are trying to look towards. And one of the ways that the World Economic Forum has looked into this, and we've been starting to have this dialogue as a lighthouse project for them globally, is through their 100 Million Farmer program, where they're looking to get climate-smart practices on 100 million farms in the next 10 years, 15 years. So the way that we're looking to do that is taking some of the best-in-class examples that are happening in Australia, in the United States, in Europe, in Brazil, on how to take that financing or get that financing and apply it in a way that's useful for farmers. And one of the last pieces that hasn't quite been perfected in this model that WEF has identified is that we need to be able to stack the different benefits and provide a portfolio to growers in a similar way that they sell their crops or their commodities or their livestock. So use systems that are familiar to the system to be able to engage all through that piece. So we have to make a business case for the investor, we need to make a business case for the farmer, and then we need that coordinating mechanism in the middle to make it work. So that's the dream.
Fantastic.
I'm going to add an additional thing to that, and I think you both brought it up sort of in a very soft way, but I'm going to call it out. It's almost that beautiful paradox that sits in the middle between, on the regenerative side, I work with Regeneration Canada, they're a client of mine, absolutely love the work they're doing, but they are sitting at that impasse and that stalled point, and what we're trying to do is help identify, well, if we're going back to nature's based and certain kinds of new skill sets and thinking and wisdom operation, what do we need to do with respect to going forward with savviness and technology to help prove that? And Nick, at CANZA, you know that more than anyone with soil carbon testing, and that takes a certain set of cycles to kind of go through that. So it's a bit of a paradox that you sit in, but that's where that systems activity is sort of guiding and sensing where folks are in terms of willingness and risk management and moving forward. So.
Yeah, I love that. It's really about what we value, what we collect as data. We heard earlier about forestry, starting to really assess what we have for crown lands, private lands. And it's neat when we lean into these ecosystem services and carbon capture, we do need to play and innovate with new technology that can be very sophisticated and very manual as well, new practices, to start broadening what we value, what we measure, and what counts in our business planning and what we report out on. So very cool. Any questions from the audience? I see Jeff is getting ready for the next panel. Thank you very, very much for our speakers today. It was a pleasure.